webinar. This is Reflections on Education Beyond the Human. This is also the theme of the upcoming CIES 2020 conference in Miami next March. And we have a great conversation. We'll be starting momentarily when I turn it over to our host, Will Bream. Before I do that, I want to introduce myself. My name is Chris Kirkhassler. I'm Assistant Professor of Curriculum and Global Studies at UW-Madison. I'm also the current chair of the SIG. Behind the scenes and helping with the production today is our incoming chair, Jun Sung, who's the doctoral candidate at University of Virginia. And we'll be behind the scenes for the webinar, managing the live stream and helping Will see whatever questions that you're posing to us. So before we begin, though, I'd like to give a quick note about our SIG. The post-foundational SIG is one of the younger SIGs in CIES. We have a few dozen members, just a few dozen members, but our scholarship is incredibly rich, vibrant, and varied. It is a space that has been created for epistemological play that is very serious and tries to get to the heart of things, what we do as scholars, challenging not only central assumptions in comparative and international education, but also those of the social sciences more generally. For example, who or what counts as a human, and how has the human come to define what counts? Which is why we consider ourselves very lucky to have with us today 3 outstanding scholars in the field of comparative education who, from different intellectual starting points, carry these questions into their work and have generated important insights with significant implications for our field. And I need to say that if this is the kind of conversation you're interested in hearing more of, that I do hope you consider joining ours. Okay, so just a couple logistical notes. This is now being live streamed and recorded on Facebook Live. So the easiest way to get into the conversation is just simply to type your questions into the comment box that accompanies the live stream. And I'm going to be signing off here, but I'll be watching from the live stream. And as long as I can tell that what you're asking is a question, then I'm going to pass those along behind the scenes to Will, and then he can try to work those into the conversation. So with that, I'd like to thank Iveta, Stephen, Wei Li for joining us, and I will turn it over to Will.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome Wei Li, Iveta, and Steve to the webinar and to FreshEd. So to start, I want to sort of give a little bit of context before we jump into this conversation on education beyond the human. We're speaking at a moment where the world is riven by student-led climate strikes. Greta Thunberg is perhaps the most well-known and household name. And in a way, these movements nicely capture the CIES 2020 theme to think beyond the human. At the same time, many of the themes being raised within this rubric are not exactly new within scholarship, whether we're talking about ecological thinking, climate science, social and economic precarity, the limits of capitalist resource exploitation, a Western-centric modernity, and so on. So this tension between the old and what is new in trying to think about and rethink education, and specifically comparative education, is what I hope we can spend some time doing within this conversation. So I'd like to start with Iveta. Education beyond the human can be read in a variety of ways. How do you approach it?
Thanks so much, Will, for having us on FreshEd and for the first question. There are definitely so many different ways to approach the question of education beyond the human. And as you already see from the title of the conference itself, it's not the education post-human. We very deliberately chose the term beyond to signal the much needed relationality of humans and modern human worlds around us as well. So this is kind of one of the maybe main angles that I am approaching it from. And just as you also mentioned at the very beginning of the introduction, this discussion of education beyond the human also very deliberately is positioned within the current climate crisis discussions and experiences that we all have. Because undeniably, the climate crisis situations that we are in is a result of many centuries of human-centered developments that we all contributed to, especially higher education institutions, in addition to many other institutions as well. But for centuries now, we have been producing theories that position the human at the center of everything else, and especially more recently with also theories of economic growth and other Western, philosophical ideas of human exceptionalism really led to this very precarious positions that we are in right now. So as you said, there are very many ways to approach it. And I personally approach it from, this idea of more than human worlds that we have to reposition ourselves in a more relational way to other species and other beings, whether they are living or non-living beings on Earth, and hopefully to engage engage with the world in many different ways. Also experiment with thought in more radical ways than we have experimented so far, especially in the area of education. And of course, there are lots of technical solutions and that we can think about and also link to this theme. But the idea is to, the idea was kind of situating, or framing the discussion in terms of beyond the human is to open multiple ways to approach the discussion. And so, and also multiple ways to approach the plural worlds that we are all parts of. And for me, these are the worlds of the nature, seasons, and spirits, of the ecosystems and environments, of cyborgs and of goddesses, of artificial intelligence, and of the ancestors. So a wide variety of kind of entry points into the conversation. So I guess the idea was to open up the conversation to the ideas that have existed already for a long time, but maybe have been neglected, but also open the space for some radical thought experiments that we can also play with.
So Wei-Li, would you agree with Iveta that we need to be talking about, beyond the human rather than the idea of post-human?
Yeah, I think so. But to me, the term post indicates a linear time, like pre, post, past, present, future. But more than the human or beyond the human is a more comprehensive word to me. So I do cultural foundations of education, so mostly looking at some Chinese ancient wisdom like Confucianism and Taoism. So to me, what does human mean? For example, from the Confucian perspective, maybe human being is made relationally instead of foundational individualistic center of being. And then from the Taoist point of view, it looks at the human non-human world more relationally, more ethically, probably. Yeah, so I totally agree that more than the human is better word than post or pre. Okay.
And Steve, would you see anything different here from Wei-Li or Iveta?
I wouldn't say different. I think Iveta gave a good overview of why we can't keep in this paradigm of consciousness where the human is in the center. I can certainly see there are a number of ways to get beyond that if we're to deal with not only with the current crisis, an environmental crisis, but also the challenge we have in coming further with concepts. So I was happy to start the discussion around the notion of post-human. That was, I think, part of the terms we were given. But I think Wei-Li is right as well, that has a linear connotation, and that traps us in some sense in working with the human. But I think that's a problem we all have anyway, because we're trying to come beyond human-centered scholarship, but nevertheless, many of the ultimate aim of that scholarship is to improve human life. I think that's the challenge of climate change now, that we've created this problem and we have to get out of it ourselves. And so we've got to somehow work with in some sense traditional human problems. I mean, the next stage of modernity will be the first one where those in the most disadvantaged situations will be the first to experience what comes from the current age of modernity. We'll be able to, for most of us listening to this program, will be able to protect ourselves from the worst impact of what's coming. And usually modernity, the fruits of that comes to the middle class or to the wealthy or those with connections and whatever. And we're in a situation now where the next stage of humanity will be much more uneven in ways that we can't easily address through social policies. So we've got to get beyond thinking about our science in terms of humans, but it's still going to always be for humans. And that's something that I struggle with in thinking how we actually do a science that's for the planet, but where humans are still going to be a major part of our thinking.
It seems like what we're talking about in many ways is really rethinking a lot of our field's foundational assumptions. And Wei Li, you brought up, looking at the field using sort of non-Western modes of thinking or traditions. And you brought up Confucianism and Taoism. And I want to sort of explore a little bit more what that actually looks like. So you mentioned linear time and changing the focus on the modern notion of linear time, but are there other elements to non-Western thinking beyond a human that we should be considering in our scholarship, in our foundational assumptions of comparative education?
To me, I like what Will mentioned about this dilemma that we try to get rid of the human-centeredness, but we have no other choice but to come back to the human world. That makes me thinking about a distinction I'm struggling with between this human-centeredness put as the anthropocentrism and the word of human agency. So in Confucian, there's a senior sinologist, Roger Ames, and he and his colleagues have been doing work on Confucian, reinterpreting Confucian work, hopefully as what it is. So they said when they tried to translate the Analects into English, and they found many places were talking about what does it mean to be a human. And then they found none of the places really speak direct to the Western idealistic, the essential notion of human being. So they, instead of using the common concepts like virtue or moral education or individualistic human beings, instead they proposed a new term, Confucian role ethics, to rethink human beings as being relational, as being made through playing relational different roles in various settings.
And Yvette, I want to bring you into this conversation. I mean, how would you approach, rethinking some of these foundational assumptions in our field?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And actually, I have been rethinking a lot of my own work in the recent years as well. Actually, even going back to the very first article I published as a graduate student in 1996, which was on textbooks in Soviet Latvia, and also looking at the Soviets at these textbooks in the context of transition from the Soviet to the post-Soviet, and kind of looking at how some of the main ideas of the human, of the time and space have changed during that process. But since then, I also have added some of the pre-Soviet textbooks kind of to look maybe more comprehensively and broadly at these textbooks. And I'm not sure if it was because I added, I brought a sample to the, to this research, or probably because I myself have changed quite a bit over the years too. But suddenly I have noticed so many more things that I have never noticed before. So just to go back to, some of the previous comments as well. So for example, alongside the linear times that children learn in early literacy textbooks, they also learn in a Latvian context, even during the Soviet times and in the post-Soviet times, they also learn the circular time. and they learn how life revolves around the different stages of the sun and the moon, and how it revolves around the different nature seasons. Or that there is a very, very deep rootedness that is also taught at the same time as kind of the ideas of modernization and urbanization are taught to children. And then ultimately, which I think also was surprising to me, and maybe because it also was such a very close part of my growing up in Latvia, but that I maybe did not even notice it immediately in textbooks when I was doing analysis of these textbooks as a academic, as a comparative education scholar. So I also noticed, looking at them more recently, that we actually, so these textbooks also teaching children how to communicate with stones, with flowers, how to listen to them, how to be, basically how children or humans more broadly are no different at all than the stones that they pass by on a daily basis. And so to me, it was, really interesting just to kind of observe my own kind of transformation, because when I started doing research at Teachers College at Columbia, I obviously was trained very specifically to look at particular things and not notice other things. And I think the kind of once you shift your gaze, but I think it's not only the gaze that you shift, I think it's also when you move yourself in a different way, you just see that there are so many other worlds around. And we in comparative education only write about one world, the Western modern world, and the schooling that is so central to it. And so, but I think if we only kind of shift ourselves and the way we look at the world, I think we can notice so much more. And so that's really fascinating to me.
It is quite interesting, this idea that, these multiple worlds exist. It's just we're not able to see them because of our own particular training or upbringing or socialization or whatever it is. And all three of you mentioned this idea of relationality, trying to bring relationality back into some of our methods and epistemologies of our own research in the field of comparative education. But I want to sort of, also think historically here, because this idea of relationality has been for quite some time a topic of discussion in the field of comparative education. So Steve, how should we be thinking about relationality, and what is the value of looking back at history of other scholars of comparative education that have also talked about such a concept before?
Well, I think before looking backwards, I guess it's good to have an object in mind. I agree with Iveta that comparative education in particular has always had a one world approach. It may not have, even when it wasn't trying to export a particular educational method and research approach and then policies, it was nevertheless seeing the world through a common lens. And then differences were always able to be measured or assessed based on a zero, like an epistemological 0 point. So that's in the DNA of comparative education, which is a big problem. But if we're talking about where we're at now and the changes that are coming in scholarship, I guess it would be helpful to try and take some bearings there and agree where we're going. So of course there's a climate crisis. People are responding to that in different ways with in curriculum and with advocacy, and then taking the sort of broader approach that Iveta talks about in scholarship. There's a lot of different responses there. But I guess from my perspective, I guess I started my academic work in comparative education doing critical ethnography, so some sort of very light Frankfurt School critique, but often leveled against the development industry, but also elitism in host countries, and then I moved into Foucault. And I didn't really immerse myself in that. And then I sort of left and have gone into something that's probably much more postmodern in a way. But one of the things I notice now reading the journals, especially when environment is not necessarily the aim of the article, but is a subtext, is much of the work on new materialism is one of the growing areas that's undoubtedly going to become important in comparative education, because it's now a major strand in educational studies. So a lot of those new materialist scholars do fantastic work exactly along the lines Iveta was talking about seeing things that were always right in front of our eyes, but but because of various processes, I guess, of like abyssal thinking, De Souza Santos would say, they were excluded from our, you would only see a stone if you could use a stone. You wouldn't see it for the thing in itself, but for what it could be in terms of exchange value. So we've always been in the world where everything is available, but we're just like De Souza Santos says about world knowledges. We live in the West with maybe 5 or 10% of the world's knowledge accessible to us. So most of the understanding of the world is invisible to people in the West. And I think that's been the problem in comparative education, that we've been able to see the world, but only on certain terms. So I think new materialism is one important reference point for a lot of this discussion, because it builds on the past, I think, in many productive ways. But there's also a healthy critique there for how we come further. And I think many new materialists came out of Marxism and then transitioned into sort of Foucauldian governmentality theory, and that many of them have told me, and some have written about how it just no longer provided the vocabulary they needed. It didn't. Bronwyn Davis was one who said it just doesn't have the post-structuralism, just doesn't carry the concepts anymore. I can't use the concepts for what's coming in the future. Others, I think Betty St. Pierre has said that post-structuralism has come to the end because it was so deeply mired in humanism. Even though it was trying to decenter the subject, it's just trapped in humanism, and there's just not concepts for it to come further. So now we're at a stage, I think, with something like new materialism, which is where it goes back to what I started with. It's a tricky area, because you're trying to do justice to the world as it is, but of course it's always received through the thinking and writing subject. And that's a challenge, I think. We know that from both Eastern religion and undoubtedly from a lot of indigenous belief systems, that to put words on things reduces them to something much less than their essence. And we're in the business of writing words. We've got a real challenge, because we have to end up using this really inadequate sign system to explain the richness and complexity of the world. So, but having said that, it's a long way to introduce the notion that many of these things have been there, at least in the Western tradition. Without going into a lot of detail, we all sort of know that it comes back in some Southern theory writing, that Spinoza's idea of one world as monism is something that never really was enabled to flourish in Western philosophy. Descartes' idea of the thinking subject became much more of a dominant way of thinking, and the idea that reason could conquer is something that we still live with, I think, all through the sciences, including comparative education. But this idea of unknowability and otherness and difference, that's been there. That was there in Kant's philosophy. It was there in Hegel, even though he had this notion of a system that would lead through dialectic reasoning to absolute consciousness, where you could understand everything, you could negate everything. He said that because we needed to do that through human consciousness, there would always be things that we could never grasp, right? And we knew that in Romantic philosophy, that human beings were in the world, but they could never realize themselves without nature. Of course, that was still a project about man at the center, but it was already an acknowledgement then that there were forces much bigger than reason that would help us become not knowledgeable, but to become aware. I think so. And of course, that went through to Nietzsche, which is the starting point for a lot of our contemporary ideas, even though we may not realize it anymore. Nietzsche's ideas of perspectivization, perspectivism, the idea that the challenge to metaphysics, the challenge to idealism, and then to ethics, morality. you know, where the subject is always drifts back into the center, and the world is seen through not only consciousness but morality. We know those things. We know that these things have been traps in Western science for, you know, 300 years. And I think new materialism does its best now to be aware of this trap, that it's the thinking subject that needs to express the unstatable, the impossibility of knowing. You know, so I think you could use new materialism, which to me it sounds like a harsh critique, but most new materialist work I read is centered in Deleuze only. And of course, Deleuze was building on Nietzsche, who was building on those critiques of Kant and Hegel. You know, and those things get lost. So it often sounds like Deleuze was the original thinker who was taking us beyond the human. And I think those things were there, at least in the Western intellectual tradition, from Kant. And so, you know, one of the things I'm trying to do now in a book that's trying to re-theorize and consider new methods in comparative education is to go back to some of those historical debates, if you can call them that, about what can man know. You know, what are the limits to our knowledge, and what is there beyond the knowable? Because that's where I think that's the starting point for new materialism. Is, you know, what can we know beyond the things we've ever looked at before?
So Wei Li, is what Steve's saying about, you know, the value of new materialism something that, you know, you would use in your own scholarship or in your own thinking when you consider ideas of beyond the human?
Mm-hmm. I found the idea on the limitation of the vocabulary is fascinating. To me, I would usually put it as the issue of language, and not just the language, and also the English grammar. Maybe not just the English grammar, but the Western language systems, the grammar. And then I think my work draws upon Heidegger's thinking, Foucault's thinking a lot. And I think that, for example, this representation issue is what is the most often critiqued in new materialism. And to me, representation is not reducible to metaphysics, to language only, but it's inevitably linked to the issue of language. So currently I'm working on a paper that looks at, that draws upon Susan Hendelman's work, The Slayer's Moses, and she traces back the theological roots of the representational thinking. And so through this Greco-Christian principle of seeing, which is grounded modes of representation, that behind the Greek drive to see through image. So that's to me fascinating. And she explicates that principle of seeing in comparison with the rabbinic modes of hearing. And what I'm doing now is relate these two to the Chinese I Ching, the mode of observing. So observing, it's not just a psychological notion that presumes a subject seeing something as an object. Rather, it tells a different story, a different onto-epistemology that is based upon the Chinese, the Asian Chinese correlative cosmology, things like that. So I really like the idea, the limitation of the vocabulary, not just the vocabulary, but language or the Western metaphysics. And another thing, I think being relational to me depends upon how you think about the relation, the concept of relation. And Heidegger, in a nice piece of Identity and Difference, I think he mentions there are two ways of relating difference as relating relation as relation. So between the, for example, things A and B. So usually people start with presuming this A and B as separate essentialist things, and then you connect them together, basically by asking what is the essential identities of A or B. But Heidegger says there's another way of thinking about relation as the belonging together, not putting the emphasis on the togetherness, but instead on the word belonging. In that case, that disrupts the ontic viewpoints of A and B, but relate them into a dynamic movement in between, which is relation per se. So really like these ideas
Hmm.
fascinating and inspiring to me.
Yeah, so Yvette, I want to bring you into this conversation because what Wei Li is sort of beginning to talk about is really a new way of understanding the idea of comparison, which is, the field that sort of links us all together. So, how do some of these critiques of the human, of the subject, of sort of decentering the subject, of relationality, of new materialism that we've been talking about, how does this impact the very sort of methodological discussion of comparison?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I actually just very recently read, I have been reading a lot of work by Isabel Stengers, and just very recently have read one article that is exactly on comparison and how we can rethink comparison in this context of the ideas we are discussing right now in modern human worlds. And so she makes this really interesting claim that true comparison can only be made, true comparison cannot be done one way. It has to be multi-directional and involve on equal basis all of the peoples that are involved in that, all of the beings that are involved in the comparison. And it has to be done full force and with no foul play. And so by foul play, she basically means that one person or being cannot impose his or her or its theoretical framing to interpret or analyze the other. That it always has to be a two kind of directional or multi-directional comparison. And so to me, such comparison is built on a very deep relationality as well. It also kind of captures this also ideas that we are never alone, that we are always becoming with the others. And so here the work, I think also Stenger's works connects really nicely with Donna Haraway's work, right? So so the comparison is not done by an individual person within a particular framework, but already from the very beginning is I guess framed as something, as a process of becoming with. And so I think that's really interesting to explore. And if we approach comparison from this perspective, then I think for me too, so I've been recently using this idea, kind of playing also with the idea of comparison as actually being a connective tissue between the different worlds or different groups or different ideas, rather than a dividing or at the dividing line, which I think we usually use comparison as. And probably the best example is all of the rankings that we see on PISA or on TIMSS. So this is where the hierarchies, comparison comes as creation of divisions and hierarchies. But what if we think about comparison as actually creating connections or being a connective tissue between the different, whether it's ideas or beings or worlds or whatever we are comparing?
So Steve, would you agree with Yvette on, she's beginning to talk about some of these critiques of the current field of comparative education. How do you see the current field of comparative education? What are the limitations? Where are your critiques coming from this, new materialist perspective that you have articulated?
I wouldn't say, I certainly wouldn't label myself a new materialist. I'm not sure I guess some people do that. But I've been I'm not sure it's necessary to have a label, but I think the way Yvette was articulating the challenge is absolutely right. I don't know that Stenger's piece, but I think there's, excuse me, there's a lot of richness of concepts in the 2 or 3 minutes she explained that article. Things have moved a lot. I think if I could be not so humble, I think I've been part of a generation that includes Yvette and some other good colleagues that have really shifted things in the last 10 years. Of course, the core of comparative education, I think, hasn't changed much, since its high watermark in the 60s. And with government policies and we know all that about funding flows and so forth. We know a certain sort of comparative work that's as Yvette says, that's a dividing work. That's still the most dominant form, and then that filters through educational programs and doctoral training and policy work, and it's a cycle. So of course we're in a field that we're part of undercutting by always comparing different thinking. We're comparing and looking for different objects, and that object is always outside us as the observer, and we pick objects that are deliberately in a family, but they're different. And that's a in some way that's like a psychosis we have in our field, that's what we think of as comparative. But I think Iveta turns that around from within a Western, I'm not sure it's a Western or a Southern thing, but from a tradition that I could understand very easily. I think she opens up to an entirely different comparative project. And I guess Whaley could find the same thing in Eastern, certainly in Taoism. You would find the same reluctance to separate objects, both from themselves and from the position of the observer. But I like this, not knowing that piece from Stengers. I think, we could all be encouraged to think of comparative work as multi-directional and multi-dimensional. I think you could convince even the hardest sort of quantitative people in comparison. They would understand that argument, I think, and we could move towards a more humane and more humble way of doing comparative work. I'm sure that's possible one day. But I like this idea she only just mentioned about from Stanger saying, and there can't be any foul play, right? Because that gets really tricky again, because once I think we can all understand the Southern knowledge critique, that we can no longer explore the world on our terms, and that we have to have not only an awareness of the other, whoever that might be, but we have to be able to take into account all of those different interests and understandings of the world. How you codify that into a language or into a research report, that's a visual document mainly grounded in text. That's another thing. But what I've struggled with, I think it's easy to see comparative education as an act of pure violence, right? Of course, it's just violent. It's always just been violent, right? And it came out of violent cultures. It was violent cultures that invented science, and they imposed that, and they've used it for their own means, just like you use a gun. It's just been, that science has been violent. So getting away from that will be difficult, because we're also trapped in institutional arrangements where certain ideas are valued more, certain publishing forms are valued more, certain languages are valued more. And all of those things contribute to foul play, So I've taken another route, which I'm not sure it will be successful, but in the book I've been writing with the colleague in Denmark, we deliberately compared 3 countries that comparativists would never compare together. In the way I did with my earlier Policyscape thing, trying to compare policy frameworks in 3 radically different countries. So we've done that about young people's engagement in school in urban Denmark, in South Korea, and in Zambia. And they were deliberately contexts that people would think of as different, geopolitically different in different ways, although we didn't accept that. And then we've deliberately written this book in fragments. Even the theory and method chapters are written in fragments, because our position, which came from I think a little from Southern theory, but also from post-colonialism, was that the original state of the world was fragmented, and it was part of the Enlightenment project to unify that into something that looked coherent. So we're all doing research in context where coherence is the most valued thing, but that itself is a project. To find coherence in a world that's fragmented, that's a project. But we have this naivety of thinking it's an honorable, it's a scientific task to get to the original state. The original state was coherence, and research is aimed at finding the coherence. I'm not sure that was ever the case, and certainly not the case under global conditions. So we've deliberately written a book that's fragmented to sort of reflect the way, and this is the foul play thing, but to reflect the way that we think young people look at the world. They don't panic when they see fragmentation. They make fragmentation work for them, as we all do in our daily life. So that's sort of like a framework for trying to write about the world, but the danger is it's still the author in the center. It's still 2 white Europeans writing about the world. And that, and we're both, in writing this book, we were both really, really influenced in our own ethnographic work by the writing culture movement. This notion that ethnography is constructed ethnography is about creating the world, not representing the world. We often have this naive view that when we do ethnography, we represent the world. But of course, as we write it, we make the world. So if the world is fragmented and the writer is making the world, that's a double challenge for comparative work. If you can't just study a place and the author no longer has an authority, right? Where do you go after that? And so in my case, I was really inspired I've always been inspired by literature, but as Iveta was sort of implying, that was something, a passion and an expertise I had that I had to leave at the door. I couldn't bring that into my scientific work, which is insane, because what my scientific work was always literary work anyway. But now I've tried to make my academic work literature. Bourdieu would call it social poetics. Jean Baudrillard would call it fatal writing, where you're deliberately writing to confuse and to undermine. But I've been really inspired by magical realism in literature, Latin American literature in particular. But my favorite book of all time was Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Child, Children, which actually told you in some sense a fantasy novel got closer to the truth of India's story of independence than any history book would have helped you get to. So we've been writing in fragments, but then also, in some sense, I hate to use the word, but inventing our data. We always invent our data because we decide what we put in our research report. So that's always just the tip of an iceberg of the empirical field. It's always fabricated anyway. But now we've deliberately tried to write from the perspective of young people, but often in ways where young people have told us things and we've seen things that would undermine our credibility. So it remains to be seen whether that works, but we've got sections there where we're describing what a young person says and does, but then also having another section where the young person develops another voice where they're reflecting on our position as researchers. Right, and the aim is to make the reader realize all the time that they don't necessarily know where they stand, that you can't take the text at face value, right? That truth is something you'll only ever understand as awareness much later when you've digested what you've read, but you're not going to get the truth just coming out of the page. But that's sort of turning comparative education into literature. Right, and I think Iveta does that really well in a recent article she wrote, and not as a literary style, but bringing in this notion of magic and myth and the non-modern, so that you think, well, this is not fantasy. She's not writing about fantasy, but it's not truth either. But maybe fantasy and truth were always part of the same thing. It's just that we were brought up in our academic worlds to separate them, and that was an unfair and unreasonable and silly distinction to make between the real and the not real.
So what what this conversation has sort of focused on now is a lot about these sort of ethical implications of our research, of comparative research, have focused on, really challenging what the empirical even is in our quote unquote science, and if it can even be called empirical anymore. So Wei Li, I want to bring you back in to the conversation and just ask, how do you approach these big issues of ethics and what is empirical inside your own research, and sort of focus on the struggles you have? Like, what do you struggle with when trying to actually move, quote unquote, beyond the human?
Well, that's a very challenging question.
I'm glad you're going first.
Yeah, one branch of my study is trying to focus on the newly emerging scholarship on study as an alternative educational formation to the economic-based learning logic. And then, so basically Tyson Lewis had a book on study which draws upon Agamben's Potential and Impotential in 2013. And his second book called Inoperative Learning came out in 2018. And I like that work because the second one, what he called inoperative learning, is a form of study. And he told me he got inspiration from a Chinese Tai Chi statement or way of thinking. The weak would defeat the strong, basically, or the young would defeat the young. And then to me, this thinking about this, what counts as a possible study moment, or what counts as the possible clearing event for clearing event for study to happen, that makes me really to look at those educative moments as a data for empirical studies instead of looking at big data. Yeah, so I wish I could do work on quantitative big data empirical stuff, but I can't. So what I do is try to observe, for example, the classroom teaching and learning, and to watch out for those moments. But exactly, it's very hard because we're using the human perspective. So we're so used to our own style of reasoning and our own limitations of thinking. So sometimes it is happening. Educative moments happen all the time. But the problem lies with us. It's us who fail to recognize and see those moments. So that makes me challenge the methodologies I usually use. So I do phenomenological stuff, and I usually try to find those disruptive moments that when normal learning activity is suspended. So in the past, I would gloss over those moments as kind of not meaningful, but now I will particularly pay attention to those moments and see and unpack the happening and the possible happening and the way it suspends our otherwise naturalized styles of reasoning. Yeah.
So just to follow up, I mean, would you then say that, you know, the project that you're working on is about building new knowledge, or is it about deconstructing sort of what we or you know?
In a way, if I could put it this way, to try to challenge some common sense and how it becomes common sense, how it is normalized as normal. So for example, I recently did a paper on Confucian do after me pedagogies. So because in Chinese classrooms, teachers would mostly say, do after me, read after me, right? In language classes and in math classes, they will model the problem solving, the equation solving procedures on the blackboard. So I basically observed a few teachers teaching for a few weeks. And I found it's very intriguing that the teachers, in a very nuanced way, explain the steps by steps, right? And they say it's very important to do this. You cannot omit this A step or B step or C step, but they never explain why. So to me, that moment jumps out, strikes out as like, pedagogically, I mean, the pedagogical meaning or significance of doing after me is not consciously reflected by the teachers themselves. So in the interviews, I asked them why do you emphasize that a lot, but not explain how it is related to mathematical thinking. So I use ethnomethodology as not the mainstream sociological research methodology, and to find a moment when the student makes an error in doing the equation on the blackboard. So basically that disruptive moment shows through his hand gestures, not looking at what he thinks, but I'm looking at how he moves, how his hand moves actually. So from his hand movements, I discern a moment that he kind of made an error, and he stops his flow and move back, return to repair the error, something like that. So I use I zoom on this moment and using it as a methodology perspective to see how our thinking flow is embodied or not, or disrupted. So this moment, I call it a kind of educative moment. And I go back to the teachers talking about those moments and help them realize this possible connection between this pedagogical method and the mathematical reasoning, what is called critical thinking to me. Yeah, that's an example.
So Yvette, do you, also explore these educative moments in some of your work? Do you see your work as, or the project that we're sort of working in and discussing here, as deconstructing what we already know, or sort of building up this new knowledge, or perhaps both simultaneously?
Yeah, I actually see this project as happening at multiple levels and through multiple kind of directions. And so to me, for sure, there is definitely an important task of deconstructing, the what we have been faced with for so long, to kind of unlearning the old habits of thought and thinking. But and in those moments too, I actually look for, many of these lessons of, in deconstruction actually do come in some disruptions that happen in kind of established order of things that usually we don't question, right? And something goes wrong and suddenly poof, the whole kind of the status quo is disrupted. So these moments, I think, are really, really interesting to then really focus in and kind of understand what else is going on. But I think it's also, in addition to kind of deconstructing or critiquing the kind of the main foundations of thought, the Western modern thought in particular, I think there is also a lot in, I think there is another project. I think another project is bringing into focus other knowledges that have been maybe remained invisible, or that or maybe have been framed as illegitimate or as unimportant. So I think that's another important project. And I think a third one is also is kind of experimenting with thought and with ideas, and kind of, playing with ideas in maybe new and different ways. And so I think that's another maybe kind of a third thread that I think is important as well. So not only critiquing and deconstructing, but also bringing into focus what's already there, but we are not really working with for many different reasons. And I think that third line is all about kind of experimenting. And so it was actually really funny. I'll tell a short story. I just recently wrote an article for a special issue on, actually, that's called Moving Beyond the Western Horizon, that I'm also co-editing together with Jeremy Rapley, with Yuan Aldis, and with Yo Yoon, and it will be published in East China Normal University Review of Education journal. So I just wrote an article, which I was writing as kind of, I thought, empirical, real research article. And one of the reviewers read it. I just received the review. She absolutely loved it. And she said, this is just a fabulous speculative thinking work. And the whole time I was writing the article, I thought I was actually doing real, quote unquote, research. Well, you say what's real. Anyways, but I think that I think the whole point of speculative thinking, of fabulation, which Steve mentioned before, is crucially important to kind of rethink what we do as researchers and as academics.
So as we draw to a conclusion here, I want to be self-critical. I want to ask about, okay, sure, it's easy to critique where the field was. It's easy to propose all these great new ideas, but what are we missing? So Steve, can we start with you by way of conclusion, basically? How can we be self-critical? What are what are some of the gaps? What are some of the blind spots in these different ways of, doing comparative research that we've talked about today?
Blind spots. Yeah, I think one thing is the biggest. I would be happy if, and I think it's still the case when you go to a conference. Your average delegate will get up and make a presentation and say, I've studied such and such in this context, and I did these interviews, and here's what the data said. And it's almost as though they're a commentator bringing in that classroom from Wisconsin or Zambia or whatever, and they're giving you access to that real thing. And if they're very good at their job, they're just able to give you more access to the real thing. Right? And I think that's just part in the DNA of Western social science. To be realist, to be practical, to be valid, generalizable, all those sorts of things. So I think the biggest blind spot is that we're not humble enough to realize that we're always thinking about and writing about the world from a perspective, and we need to be able to defend it from that perspective without rejecting others. I mean, I think that things would be much easier if someone could tell us there is one right way. We just haven't found it yet, right? But there's never going to be one way. That would be reducing the world to a level of banality. There'll never be one way to understand things. So I think there's that. That's the biggest blind spot. And I think you can. The very best students are aware of that. But I would say also they end up gravitating towards the type of area that we've been discussing today. Those ones who have that humility, that they realize the subject is a construction, that reality is a myth, that writing is violence, and so forth. They're the ones that end up coming to our table at the conference. Whereas the mainstream of the production of academic scientists is based on an entirely different logic. So I think the SIG was one small intervention that was difficult to get accepted, believe it or not. That took more than a year for the board just to accept the idea of a non-scientific SIG. Having a conference now that is on a radically different perspective is a start. I think it'll be difficult for people to live with the dissonance, to come to Miami with business as usual and be at a conference where it's not possible to go home with the same view of the world. So I think these are sort of blind spots that are much more fundamental about what it means to be a researcher. And we can always have our different strategies of advocacy, of making education programs, which I've done, or of writing good articles, which we all do. That's sort of more hit and miss about volume and access to people. But I think that the biggest blind spot is our collective delusion that we think we're actually studying and explaining the world. Right? It's delusion.
Wei Li, I mean, a few questions. I mean, do you share that same notion of delusion that Steve is talking about? But more importantly, how are you self-critical in some of these thoughts that you've discussed today?
To me, what strikes out, or what Steve said resonates with me, is to think about where does educational knowledge come from? Or just like, for example, education is not just a field brought out of nowhere. And now people always critique education or the social science, scientificism, epistemologies that ground the way the knowledge is constructed and reproduced in education. But in my own work, I have a language background. That's why I always look at the issues of being, representation, meaning, hermeneutics, exegesis, something like that. So a challenge to me is to think about what kinds of conditions of possibility that have made educational knowledge possible. That's what we usually ask. But now I'm asking, what kinds of onto-epistemological principles that have made the current thinking about education as limited as it is? What have made it impossible to rethink about education as what education could possibly be? That's what I'm struggling with now. Yeah.
And so for the final question, I'll return to Iveta where we began and ask about, your own blind spots. We've pointed out a lot of blind spots of the field and critique of the field. And this sort of notion of moving beyond the human, do you anticipate, or can you even, if you think about it, are there particular blind spots within that conception of comparative education?
There's probably so many blind spots that we are not even aware of at all. But I think to me, and it's really interesting because it resonates so closely also with what Wei Li has been talking about, and also Steve. I think to me, it's also the questions about what else aren't we seeing, right? What else aren't, what else is beyond that we can't even comprehend, right? And imagine. And again, here, maybe I will refer back to Isabel Stenger's work, because so when she talks about this idea of speculative thinking, or SF, that also others play with, she really talks about it as kind of this thought experiment that helps us to reimagine the world differently, but also kind of resituate the given within a much vaster set of possibilities. And so one strategy that she suggests we could use for that is ask a question, and if something could be differently, right? And so this kind of the question, and if, something that in kind of radical thought experiments that maybe are, that are really missing in our field, right? Because we're not really asking, about other ways of, thinking or doing or being. So I definitely, so to me, that's a major challenge. Ask this question, and if all the time, but also I must say is something that really, really kind of inspires a lot of curiosity. It also makes comparative education much more exciting for me than it was before. So kind of playing with this and if question is absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you, Iveta and Wei Li and Steve, for joining this webinar. It was inspiring. It does make me get new excitement for the field of comparative education. So thank you very much. And I guess I'll see most of you in Miami next year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Wei Li and
Bye-bye.
Steve. Bye. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're off now.
Hey, but hey, I forgot to tell you, can I tell really quickly? So actually, did you notice that at the conference this year, we also have the visual art and performance arts as well. So you can present your research findings not only as, PowerPoint presentation or empirical findings. So it would be, and we received quite a number actually of submissions. It would be really fascinating to see, how far we can go beyond the words, right? The written word or the spoken word.
I love it. I love it.
Remember, Iveta, do you remember in it was in Charleston 100 years ago that Carlo Albertus, he had all his graduate students on stage and they had a performance.
Yeah. I think they may be doing something similar again.
Yeah.
The